Hey everyone, Tactics here, kicking off my Dungeon Guide series for Season 1 of The War Within with the Stone Vault. In this video, I'll be going over the most important trash and boss abilities that you should be aware of and how I recommend you handle them, with the focus here on Mythic and Mythic Plus difficulty, but a lot of this will also apply to heroic dungeons as well. If you want to see what every single ability in a dungeon is, then make sure you check out my ability spreadsheet linked in the description below, which has links to every single ability as well as organizing them based on what they do, and even has a pug-friendly route in there as well. For those more interested in a written resource, I also maintain the method dungeon guides over on their site, so make sure to check those out again in the description. Otherwise, let's get into the dungeon, starting with the trash leading up to the first boss, where the most important one is the Ghastly Void Soul with their Howling Fear cast. As expected, this fears your entire party, which is very, very bad, so make sure you interrupt every single one of these. One interrupt on each of these mobs is more than enough. On top of that, the other caster in this area are the Cursed Heart Invaders. Use all of your spare interrupts, not on the fear, on their Arcing Void ability. This hits a random player and splashes to nearby players, so if for ones that you can't interrupt, just make sure your group is loosely spread to try and avoid that splash. These guys also have an instant cast in Void Infection, which curses a random player. This is a very, very nasty dot, so you want to make sure you have curse spells in this dungeon and dispel this as much as possible. Outside of that, there's a Lieutenant Mob and Earth-Infused Golems. Not a ton here. They have a frontal that they'll shoot at the tank, so make sure tanks you're pointing this mob away from your group. And they also do an AoE hit to your party, which can be dangerous in combination with some of the other random damage from the Cursed Heart Invaders, so just be aware of that. Eventually, you'll reach a large room that has E.D.N.A, the first boss, and the main difficulty on this fight is in controlling the volatile spikes. These spawn under 3 random players and can be destroyed in a few different ways, applying a stacking dot to your group whenever they are destroyed. When the boss reaches 100 energy, it casts Earth Shatterer, and this deals a big hit to your entire group and detonates any remaining spikes, so you want to make sure you've destroyed them before this cast happens. I recommend destroying them using the Refracting Beam ability. This just shoots a line through all 5 party members one at a time. Basically, what you can do is you can stack up before the spikes spawn, have them all spawn in one little area, and then you can just have one refracting beam be targeted at these pillars that are now all stacked up, instantly destroying them, which will also minimize your group's damage taken. Ideally, you'd have the tank player be the one aiming their beam at the spikes since they're in the least danger, but anyone can do it if they have a defensive running. Just make sure the rest of your party is loosely spread and not cleaving each other with their own beams. If you ever miss a spike, you can always have an individual player soak it as well. Just know that this deals a pretty significant upfront hit, so make sure that player uses a defensive. For tanks, you want to make sure you always have a personal up for the Seismic Smash hit, and healers, be aware, this also applies a magic dot to them that you can dispel, and when you do so, it actually gives the tank a 25% damage reduction for 3 seconds, so every other cast of this tank buster, you can actually time your dispel to apply that large DR to the tank for the next tank buster to help them survive it. From there, you can choose to either go right or left, with the right going towards the mechanical area of the dungeon and left going towards the void area of the dungeon. My default route recommends you go right here towards the mechanical area, so let's continue with that trash. To start, you've got a bunch of aspiring 4chans, and these guys have a passive in fracturing blows that tanks are really scared of. Basically, their melee attacks will stack up this 5% damage taken increase, and if there's a lot of these guys in some of these packs, you can get a very, very high number of stacks here, so be aware of this. Use AoE stuns and back up and kite if needed to drop your stacks. There's another caster in this area in Forge-bound Menders. These guys will just do a random target bolt attack, but their more important cast is Restoring Metals. This is a random target heal, so just make sure you kick that and put spare kicks into their bolts. Forge Loaders are the big lieutenant in this area, and they have a big frontal line attack in Lava Cannon. This shoots a massive orb of lava at a random player, so make sure you avoid it. It is a bit bigger than it seems, so be aware of that. Otherwise, they'll just shoot Molten Mortar at a random player, which is a pretty nasty hit and dot. Pretty dangerous, so make sure this player uses a defensive and has some extra healer attention, especially if bolts start targeting them from the Menders. At the end of this wing, you'll find the Master Machinist, which is a 2-boss encounter where you want to cleave these guys down evenly, as when one dies, the other will enrage. Starting with the Brokk, which is the smaller one, keep a kick rotation on the Molten Metal cast, and make sure you do actually save a ranged kick for when this boss jumps away, casting Scrap Song. When Scrap Song is cast, basically a big metal cube gets thrown down the center of the arena, so make sure your group moves towards the edges. Shortly after that happens, and just generally throughout the fight, Brokk will use exhaust vents. This deals some ticking damage to your entire group that you need to heal through, and it also activates 3 of the 4 vents in the corners of the arena, causing them to deal lethal damage to anyone directly on top of them, while also spitting out fire puddles in their own quadrants, which you need to avoid. When this happens, I recommend trying to move towards the quadrant with the inactive vent, just to make it easier to avoid any of these potential puddle spawns and make dodging some of Dorlita's abilities a bit less taxing. Speaking of Dorlita, you've got that same lava cannon random target line attack on a player that you need to avoid, in addition to a large tank buster in Igneous Hammer, so tanks, make sure you always have a defensive up. Finally, alternating with Brokk after Scrap Song is cast, Dorlita will drag that same metal cube to the center of the arena and cause it to explode, shooting out a lava wave from each side. When this happens, you once again want to move towards the edges of the room, but preferably here on the diagonals of the box near where the vents themselves are to avoid the lava waves. Just be careful if the vents are active, as like I said, they are lethal, so walk around them if needed. After defeating the Machinists, you can make your way back to the Void Wing using a nearby minecart to fast travel to the first boss room. In this area, the big Lieutenant mob are Void-bound Despoilers. These guys have a big AoE channel in Void Outburst, so make sure you use defensives here, healing CDs if needed. Outside of that, they just have a relatively large tank hit, so tanks, make sure you're using a defensive when that happens. Void-bound Howlers are the priority interrupt in this area. That you will use Piercing Wail, which is just a group hit that also debuffs the entire group, causing them to take more damage from successive hits. Sometimes there are going to be a couple of these in a pack, so you want to make sure you get an interrupt on every single one of these casts. Spare interrupts should be used on the turned speaker and their censoring a gear cast. It's a random target hit again, which also silences the target hit for 3 seconds. That silence is a magic debuff, so if it isn't targeting your healer, it can actually be dispelled. After fighting through this area, you'll be faced with Skarmorak, which alternates between a sort of add control phase followed by a burn phase. It's all started by the Crystalline Smash Tank Buster, so make sure you have a defensive up for this, and that'll spawn 3 shards randomly in the room. These are stationary mobs that have relatively low health, and they just deal a medium hit to your entire party when they're killed, but at the same time, this applies a 3-second vulnerability, so ideally you want to stagger killing these mobs. Tanks, you can make this a bit easier by just dragging the boss around on top of which one you want to be killed. Outside of this, the boss occasionally does a 15-yard AoE around it, which spawns some orbs underneath every single player. If you collect these orbs, it actually grants you with Void Empowerment. This increases your healing done, as well as your damage done specifically to the boss's shield when that comes up later on, but it also is a stacking dot as well, so you don't want to pick up too many of these orbs. This ability happens twice before the boss gains that shield, so I recommend players just pick up the orb that they spawn personally, giving 2 stacks per player. Zero energy, the boss will gain that fortified shell absorb I was talking about, which increases in size if there are any shards left alive, so make sure you kill them all before this happens. At the same time, the boss constantly pulses for ramping damage from Void Discharge here, and this continues until the shell is destroyed, which is why making sure that you have that buff out both in damage and healing is important. Once that shield breaks, the fight just kind of repeats from there. After Skarmorak is defeated, you can take another nearby minecart back to the first boss room, where you can now make your way towards the final boss. On your way there, there is a few more mobs you'll have to deal with. Curseforge Honor Guards are a lieutenant mob that will try and charge at random players with Shield Stampede. This is a line attack that can be avoided, so watch the arrow and make sure you avoid it, and if possible, aim it towards a wall so they don't travel too far. Rock Smashers are yet another lieutenant mob in this area, and they like to smash rock. This is a very important ability as it actually debuffs your entire party, causing them to take 10% more damage from each successive cast. So if you pull 2 of these guys at once, for example, it can get very dangerous very quickly. Make sure you're using defensives later on in the pull here as that damage amp increases. They also will occasionally just spawn swirlies under all players, so make sure you avoid those. Finally, there's the Curseforge Stone Shaper in the area. These are the caster mobs, so make sure you interrupt their bolt attack, which I believe is only tank targeted, not random targeted in this area, but still, it helps. Their important ability, though, is Earth Burst Totem. This spawns a totem, which then has a cast. If it is successful, it deals a significant amount of party damage, so make sure you swap to this totem and kill it as quickly as possible. Then we have the final boss of the dungeon, Void Speaker Eirich, where it's all about managing the dots that go out on your group. Basically, throughout the fight, Eirich will apply Void Corruption to all players. This is a ramping damage over time effect, and it has no duration. The only way to actually remove it is to step within 15 yards of one of the void rifts that start near the back of the room when you walk in. This causes it to absorb that dot off the nearby player, and then it jumps to a new location. Because of this, if you have any squishier players or less mobile players, let them clear first, and then everyone else, specifically the tank as well, can clear later on after the rifts have moved. Just makes it safer for your group. Make sure you also don't step inside the void rifts themselves when you're clearing your dot, as they will instantly kill anyone within 3 yards. Entropic Reckoning will be cast sometimes, and this can make getting to rifts a bit more difficult, as it causes every single player to deal damage around themselves in an 8-yard radius and then spawn a puddle underneath them. These puddles will slowly shrink over about a minute and a half and disappear, so it's not permanent denial, but you can still block off paths to rifts if you're not careful. If you're a tank or you have a defensive running, you can also opt to drop your puddle onto an existing puddle to preserve space. Outside of that, the boss just occasionally aims the Unbridled Void Frontal at a random player, which should be avoided. But there we have it, guys. That is my first of many Mythic Plus guides for Season 1 of The War Within. Hopefully you learned something, and if you did, be sure to hit that subscribe button, as it's the best way to support me. Otherwise, thank you to my Patreons for making this content possible, and I'll see everyone in the next video.